If you enjoy this content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot to me and helps me keep writing new stories for you. Thank you for your support. The middle of the night had come. The city, exhausted from the heat and daily worries, had sunk into saving sleep. Two figures walked along the road to Piraeus. I, a thin-bearded old man in a long himation, could barely drag my feet. A slender young man who supported me was about 25 years old. The tapping of our sandals on stone merged with the chirping of cicadas. From the moonlit, crenellated wall, an owl called out 3 times. I stopped and, placing my palm on the young man's shoulder, said, "Wait, I'll rest a little." Herodorus. "All right, Phidias," he replied. "Rest." I stepped off the road and sat down on a smooth, flat stone. But in a moment I turned toward the dark mass of the Acropolis, and immediately memory returned me to those now distant days when I was young and it was not at all difficult for me to run up to the Acropolis. The territory of the Acropolis reminded me of a battlefield. The Chorei and Choroi, thrown from their places, lay like fallen warriors with frozen smiles on their slightly painted faces. Among the fragments of broken columns, tufts of yellow grass stuck out. Under my feet, shards of precious vessels that once decorated the walls of the sanctuary crunched. How long will this trace of the barbarians' madness remain? Those who destroyed our sanctuary, I thought then. It seems the Athenians were satisfied that the gods punished the villain Xerxes for plundering the temple of the virgin goddess, and no one cares about returning the Acropolis to its former glory. My sensitive ear caught a barely noticeable noise behind me. I saw a narrow-faced young man with a strangely elongated head. After walking a certain distance, the stranger turned and moved in the opposite direction, until he stopped before a fragment of a column that lay in his path. I hurried to help the young man, and together we rolled away the column. "I am Pericles, son of Xanthippus." The youth introduced himself. If not for his elongated head, one could say he was handsome. He had widely set gray, intelligent eyes, and his slightly raised chin testified to willpower. "I heard about your father," I said. "He became famous in the war with the Persians. My father Charmides fought under his leadership. My name is Phidias. Truly, a sad sight, isn't it? How happy I would be if I could take part in restoring the Acropolis. But I have to carve tombstones." "You're a sculptor?" Pericles exclaimed joyfully. "The gods themselves sent you. I just marked out a place for a new temple of Athena, which should glorify our city." "Wait!" I interrupted him. "Who commissioned you to do this?" Pericles proudly threw back his head. "I myself. When they elect me strategos, I will persuade the demos to begin restoring the Acropolis." "Are you sure of this?" "But the demos favor Simon. He is rich and generous, and as far as I know, he doesn't intend to rest." "He will have to go," Pericles said with conviction. "The demos doesn't need the generosity of private individuals. The state should be generous to its poor citizens. I will ensure that participation in court work is paid. Theater attendance will be free. And then the demos will support all my plans." How many years have passed since my first meeting with Pericles? For the measure of time in my life was not years, but the works of my hands, the statues. We met shortly before I began working on the gigantic bronze statue of Athena the warrior, and for Pericles, time was measured by the resolutions he proposed to the demos, which became laws with their support. Pericles tore the courts from the hands of the Areopagus, the stronghold of the aristocracy. Cimon was banished, infinitely rich, equally generous, and at the same time limited and uneducated. More of a Spartan than an Athenian. The banishment of Cimon coincided with the completion of work on the statue of Athena the warrior. She rose above the Acropolis, already cleared of debris. Turning her head, the mistress seemed to embrace the entire city with her gaze, and in this gaze one could see a call, and as if obeying it, in Kerameikos and other city districts populated by craftsmen, masters put on leather aprons, tied their hair with ribbons, and went to the agora. Pericles and I were waiting for them there, dividing the masters into groups. We led them all to the Acropolis to do what would glorify the greatness of Athenian democracy, its victory over the chaos in which Athens found itself. When captured by the enemy, the great unity of the demos, freed from the external enemy, the Persians, and the internal one, the aristocracy. The ancient city, captivated by our plans with Pericles, became unlike itself. It turned into a gigantic workshop, where the hammering of hammers, the noise of blacksmith bellows, the buzzing of saws, and the creaking of wheels resounded from everywhere. From Pentelicus, where wonderful white marble with blue veins was extracted from the bowels of the mountain, they transported it in carts, in the form of drums for future columns. Mighty oxen, before being harnessed to carts, grazed on the slopes of Marathon, and, as they say, descended from that fire-breathing bull that the great Athenian hero Theseus killed near Marathon. Under the enormous load, the wheels sank into the stony ground, striking sparks. From Pentelicus to Athens lay a deep rut. From the sea, from Piraeus, on carts drawn by mules, they brought copper ingots from Cyprus, cedar boards from Lebanon. Everyone remembered the day when black-skinned slaves with elephant tusks on their shoulders passed through Athens along the Piraeus road. It seemed that Libya itself had sent its gifts to Athena, but only a foreigner who accidentally found himself in the crowd could think so. Every Athenian knew that 3 years ago, a trireme with 30 ephebes had been sent from Piraeus to Egypt. They were to sail along the Nile to its mysterious sources, to capture there a large herd of elephants and take the tusks from the forest giants. And where are these brave men? There they go, burned black by the Libyan sun. They are hard to recognize in their motley clothing, in sandals with exceptionally thick soles made from hippopotamus hide. 7 of them remained. The rest were crushed by elephants, or they drowned in the Nile, or simply couldn't endure the difficult journey. Who knows? But everyone knew that 20 gold talents had been spent on the Libyan hunt, and then an argument arose about how many times more expensive the ivory would prove to be, intended for the face and open parts of the sculpture of the mistress, than the golden plates from which her clothing would be composed. All Athenian citizens already knew how the sculpture that was to decorate the new temple of Athena would look in general outline. After all, I had presented to the 10 strategoi, and then to the Council of 500, and the Popular Assembly, its life-sized model. It was approved, but I had not only to enlarge the model 7 times, not only to replace wax, wood, and clay with gold, ivory, and marble. I had to find, instead of the conventionally created female face, such unique features, such an expression that would absorb both the image of the goddess, created by myth, and my own conception of beauty. Such statues had never been created by Greek art. All the Olympian gods of ancient masters, Athena, Artemis, Aphrodite, were similar to each other like twin sisters. They smiled identically. The smile seemed glued to the lower part of their faces. It was supposed to create the illusion of movement, but instead made an impression of artificiality, tension. Only the lips smiled, while the eyes and cheeks remained serious. The master's inability to convey the play of human cheeks and eyes impoverished the divine image. Everything in the world changes. Nothing stands still. Why then should art, which reproduces divine beauty, remain unchanged? These thoughts did not leave me when I worked on Athena's marble head, which was to become the model for the wooden head covered with ivory plates. On the floor in the workshop were scattered, processed pieces of marble. I couldn't find the proper image. How much marble you have destroyed? Pericles was surprised when he visited the workshop. He bent over a marble head with a broken nose, picked it up, and began to examine it, turning it to different sides. "What didn't you like about this head?" asked the strategos. "You understand," I said. "It lacks something, but I may be mistaken. And I like it. It has a noble face. It seems to me that she is not Athenian. Such eye shape is found in Hellenic women whose father or grandfather were Lydians. This could be a great-granddaughter of Croesus. And indeed this is not bad," I said, feeling the marble with my fingers. "I'll just have to lengthen the face a little and make the nose steeper. Come, friend, In a month, I'll work on this head. Busy with work in addition to Athena's head, I was also designing the future temple, decorated with sculptures, and didn't notice how 2 months passed. I didn't know that in Athens, and not only in Athens, but throughout all of Hellas, the name of Pericles was already linked, not with my name, but with the name of Aspasia. Pericles and Aspasia, Aspasia and Pericles. Oh, these women. The Greeks believed that all troubles come from them. After all, it was none other than Pandora, overcome by curiosity, who opened the urn in which all human vices, misfortunes, and diseases were locked, and they spread among people, as if she, Pandora, and not the gods, was to blame for this misfortune. And Helen? After all, Homer made her the culprit of Troy's destruction, although Paris kidnapped her, and she came to Priam's city, not of her own will. Aspasia came to Athens from the Asia Minor city of Miletus herself, to admire the statue of Athena the warrior on the Acropolis. Pericles saw her, and struck by her beauty, could not tear his eyes away from her. The first Strategos sent away his unloved wife and took Aspasia into his house. Such is the story of the acquaintance and love of Pericles and Aspasia, as told by reasonable and unenvious contemporaries. And others say that the Milesian woman enchanted Pericles and subjected him to her will, and supposedly all of Athens' troubles come from her. I knew nothing about these rumors because I was completely immersed in work, but one day Pericles came to the workshop, and not alone. Seeing Aspasia, I shuddered. "This is my lady Aspasia," Pericles said restrainedly. "She wanted to meet the creator of Athena the warrior, but we decided not to disturb you." Meanwhile, I was muttering something to myself, not taking my eyes off Aspasia. Then I raised my hand and, moving my fingers, felt something in the air. "Aspasia," Pericles continued with a forced smile, "don't be surprised. My friend sees you for the first time and probably—" "Not that," I interrupted him. I threw back the cloth covering the marble head. "Doesn't it seem to you, Pericles, that my Athena resembles your lady?" "Look! Incredible!" Pericles exclaimed. The same slightly elongated eyes. "But what will the Athenians say? They already accuse me of supporting impiety and encouraging godless philosophers. And seeing your Athena, they will accuse me of blasphemy. But I can call witnesses," Aspasia interjected into the conversation, "that no one saw me. If it comes to a trial, all respected Athenians will stand in your defense. Sophocles, Hippodamus, to whom I have repeatedly said that I want to meet Phidias. My resemblance to Phidias's model is accidental." "Is it accidental?" I smiled, looking at Pericles. "After all, you yourself found the marble head that became my model, and it seems that she became a model for you too." Aspasia smiled charmingly. "Then, Phidias, I owe my happiness to you." "But, Phidias," he said after a long silence, "make it so that this resemblance is not striking." "That's not difficult," I said. "Look." Taking a few steps, I picked up a bronze helmet from the floor and put it on Athena's head. "Wonderful," Aspasia exclaimed. "I always knew that a Pedasos changes appearance, but a helmet makes a person completely unrecognizable. Look how this woman with my face has become a warlike Amazon. And I regret that our descendants, many years from now, will only hear about the beauty of Aspasia," I said. "And it's also unfair that when they come to the Parthenon, they won't see those who created it." "What are you talking about, Phidias?" Pericles asked fearfully. Instead of answering, I smiled. 3 more years passed, and on the Acropolis rose the majestic temple of Athena, the Virgin, the Parthenon. It was built by the architects Callicrates and Ictinus, but the sculptural decoration of the frieze and pediments belonged to me and my students. With my master's hand, I outlined the figure, determined its place among others, and the students finished the work. Sometimes I corrected an already finished statue, so that it seemed that all the sculptural decoration of the Parthenon belonged to me alone. I valued talent and creative enthusiasm in young men, hated flattery, and accepted no gifts from students. Everyone remembered how I drove away the rich shipowner Athenodorus, who wanted to change my attitude toward his son Menon. A diligent but untalented student, through gifts, I began to assign Menon such simple tasks that any craftsman could perform them, and then completely refused his services. The consecration of the temple took place during the celebration of the great Panathenea. On the night of the 28th of the month Hecatombeon, a torch race took place in the city. The winner was considered to be the one who arrived first with a burning torch. At dawn, the participants of the festive procession gathered at Keramakos. From a special building near the Dipylon gates, the sacred vessels and other items used annually were brought out. Heralds in white clothing, which resembled the clothing on sculptures, announced by order of the priests the order of actions that each group of festival participants should perform. In front walked young men carrying a model of a ship, on whose mast, in the form of a sail, the goddess's peplos shone with gold. For 9 months it had been woven by nimble-fingered maidens, the best craftswomen of the city. This clothing on the day of the Panathenea was to cover the shoulders of the goddess, who was considered the first craftswoman. The young weavers put all their diligence and skill into the peplos, but no one thought to boast of their ability. Everyone remembered what Athena did to the boastful Arachne. She turned her into a spider. Then came maidens in high-girdled chitons. They carried sacred gifts on their heads, tall vessels, boxes with precious items, complex chairs of black wood and ivory, for gods and goddesses. Black ones were intended for underground gods, white ones for heavenly ones. Young servants in white chitons, girded with red scarves, led fattened white bulls with gilded horns and ribbons on their mighty necks, as well as white sheep. All these animals would be sacrificed to Athena, and their meat would treat the entire community. People would share the feast together with their patroness. The dust from hooves and little hooves had barely settled when musicians appeared with trumpets and flutes decorated with ribbons. They raised them to their lips, and the sacred melody filled the hearts of Athenians with prayerful ecstasy that seemed to bring them closer to the great goddess. Behind the musicians walked gray-bearded, gray-haired, but still vigorous and handsome for their age, old men. These were participants in battles with the Persians, powerless witnesses to how Xerxes, having captured the Acropolis, set it on fire. The old men triumphantly waved olive branches, and people in the crowd greeting the procession wept with joy. Finally, the participants of battles at Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea had lived to see the restoration of the Acropolis. And what a restoration! The Acropolis, destroyed by the Persians, now stood immeasurably richer and more beautiful. But what are these measured sounds? The clatter of hooves. Horsemen appeared, 4 in a row, on white purebred horses. The crowd was in raptures. The Athenian cavalry, its glory. The Athenians knew every horseman. In the first 4 was the handsome Alcibiades, nephew and ward of Pericles. He had the best horses, the best quails, and whatever he, through the monumental marble gate, the Propylaea, the festive procession entered the Acropolis. It passed by the statue of Athena the warrior, which rose to the sky, to the marble shining Parthenon. Going around it, the procession participants admired the reliefs on the frieze. There such Panathenea were depicted. Their participants, male and female, were carved from marble by me and my students. They are to glorify Athena not for a year, not for several years or even decades, but for several centuries or maybe even millennia, until the solid stone turns to dust. And here the procession enters the temple. Those who saw the goddess for the first time fall face down, blinded by the firmness of her gaze and the gleam of her clothing made of pure gold. The goddess stands, leaning on a shield, unable to take their eyes off the goddess's face. They pay no attention to the images on the shield. But these people standing under the columns seem to be in the temple not for the first time. They whisper among themselves, "Do you see that warrior in the helmet? That's clearly Pericles' face. And that bald old man with a hammer? Of course, that's Phidias. Blasphemy. Pericles and I, standing nearby, hear this whisper. Let the enemies hiss. The world has never seen such a temple. And again throughout the city the names resounded joyfully. Pericles and Phidias. Phidias and Pericles. Solon laid the foundation of democracy. Cleisthenes strengthened it. Pericles and I erected on it a majestic temple, a monument to democracy. Phidias, it's time, a voice rang out. Dawn will come soon, and they might notice your absence in prison. Let's go, Herodorus, I replied, and here we are walking side by side again, teacher and student. But the memories that captured me do not let go, and I am no longer in Athens, but in Olympia, a wasteland behind the sacred place. Sparks from a fire fly into the night sky, and it seems that the number of stars increases there. Here I don't have students yet. Herodorus was the first. That night his father brought him, explaining that he was a helmsman and couldn't take the boy to sea, and his mother had died a few months ago. In the morning I said to Herodorus, "Show me what you can do." The boy molded a fox from clay that seemed to be running. Not bad. I approved and added, "I will teach you." Later there were other students, but Herodorus remained the most beloved and most talented. We got a workshop with a gigantic cauldron in the middle. On the day we finished the model of the statue of Zeus from clay and wax, news came of the death of the ship of Apollonius, Herodorus's father. I replaced the boy's father. Oh, how wonderfully envious fate combines joy and sorrow. We had just finished work on the marble head of Zeus, when a letter came from Athens with the news that I, Phidias, was accused of stealing state gold intended for the goddess's clothing. I immediately understood that by accusing me, they wanted to strike a blow at Pericles, and leaving all my affairs, I began to prepare for the journey. Oh, how Herodorus begged me not to do this. "Think, teacher," he said, pointing to the already finished marble model of Zeus's head. "Who, besides you, can embody your plan in ivory and gold? Your statue should decorate the temple of the Pan-Hellenic sanctuary in Olympia. But I am an Athenian. My homeland threatens me with dishonor. If I don't appear, they will declare me a thief. And can a thief work on a statue of the father of the gods? But there your enemies will pounce on you. I heard that your former student, Menon, became the accuser. He wanted to be my student, but didn't become one," I responded. "I sent him away for lack of talent." "But such non-entities are the most dangerous," said Herodorus. "Enemies will tear you apart like angry dogs. Can you go alone to this pack? After all, you are the glory of all Hellas. Let's leave this," I said sternly then. "I know your devotion. Your arguments are reasonable. But I am a hostage of Athens. If I don't return, then a shadow will fall not only on me, but also on my friend Pericles." It happened exactly as Herodorus predicted. How can one justify oneself before people blinded by hatred? 500 Heliasts, who were examining the slander of a vile sycophant, who supposedly observed how I, boarding a ship in Piraeus, bent under the weight of gold, saw in the performance of their duties a means to satisfy passions and prejudices. Proof of my guilt was for them already the fact that I had gone to Olympia, to the hostile Peloponnese. It meant nothing to them that I had been invited to decorate the Pan-Hellenic sanctuary. They didn't care that this accusation was immediately and easily refuted. After all, Pericles, who knew his fellow citizens well, had advised me at the time to make the golden parts of the sculpture removable. And when the gold removed from the goddesses, the body was weighed before them. Everyone saw that all 40 talents of metal were in place. And still the trial continued for another whole month. First the accuser spoke of theft of ivory. But when this accusation too was rejected, the judges condemned me to imprisonment for blasphemy. He insulted the mistress, the court decision said, by depicting Pericles and himself on her shield. I was convinced that the judges were stalling, advancing ever new accusations, because they received 2 obols for each session. They received this money for nothing. One didn't have to dig the stony ground, blow the furnace, raise the hammer. 2 obols just for sitting, listening and voting. So was Pericles mistaken when he began to pay for participation in council work and court sessions? I thought painfully. And would it have been better if the right to judge belonged to the nobles? But they too could have been bought. After all, no less than 300 years ago, the poet Hesiod called aristocratic judges devourers of gifts. Suddenly from memory arose the image of Athena, my Athena, who adorned the wonderful temple of the Acropolis. If there had been no law of Pericles about 2 obols for participation in court, there would have been no Parthenon. How wonderfully connected in mortal affairs are facts and events that, it would seem, have nothing in common. 2 sticky obols, intended for each of these poor men so they could tear themselves away from their affairs and sit in court, and a temple of shining marble, a statue of the goddess in golden robes, and an unjust verdict that threw me into prison. Pericles, the father of democracy, could do nothing to help his friend. The system he created had turned against him. The first strategos was blamed for all the troubles and failures that befell the state. First they condemned his teacher Anaxagoras, the great sage, the first to put forward the principle that the universe is arranged not by the will of the gods, not by chance, but by reason. Anaxagoras was accused of considering the sun not a god, but a huge molten mass. The philosopher was sentenced to death in absentia, and would have perished if he hadn't been lucky enough to escape, and they couldn't manage to sentence me to death. But they wanted to send an assassin to the prison, and not simply to poison me, but to accuse Pericles of poisoning, who supposedly feared that the sculptor knew something shameful about the first. Strategos, oh vile people! If not for Herodorus, who learned about these plans. I stopped and embraced Herodorus. Oh gods, where is justice? Thank you, boy. No, I wasn't afraid of death. Let's go faster, teacher. I can already see the ship. They're waiting for us. The ship quickly glided over the morning wave, colored by rosy-fingered Eos. Herodorus was at the steering oar, son of Apollonius. I held onto my student's shoulder. Boreas ruffled my gray hair. The ribbon that held it fell overboard. Did you hear, teacher? Herodorus asked me without turning around. The demos freed the vile sycophant Menon from all duties, and ordered the strategos to care for his safety. But this didn't help. Tonight someone killed him. I remained silent. Perhaps I didn't hear these words, or I was already indifferent to the demos' expression of hatred toward me, and I wasn't pleased that the slanderer was punished as he deserved, and I wasn't interested in how Herodorus learned about Menon's murder. If he had been beside me, with me, all night, or was I so unperceptive that I didn't understand that at midnight it was a person who cried with the voice of an owl? Or perhaps I understood all this. But I had no time for all these trifles. Before my eyes arose the majestic image of Zeus of Olympia, displacing from memory Athena, born from my head. The memory of Zeus took hold of me completely now. There, in Olympia, where the sacred games brought together all of Hellas, where the finest athletes competed under the watchful eyes of the gods, I was to create something that would surpass even my Athena. But how different that time was from the glorious days in Athens, when Pericles and I worked together as one mind, one vision. In Olympia, I worked alone with my students. The workshop was vast, larger than any I had ever commanded. The centerpiece was an enormous bronze cauldron where we would melt the gold and prepare the ivory. The very air seemed thick with anticipation and the weight of sacred responsibility. Here, I would create the father of all gods in his full majesty. When I first conceived the statue of Zeus, I knew it must be different from anything that had come before. The seated god would rise nearly 40 feet high, his head almost touching the ceiling of the temple. His throne would be a masterwork in itself, adorned with precious stones and intricate carvings. But it was the expression on his face that consumed my thoughts, day and night. How do you capture divinity itself in ivory and gold? How do you make mortal eyes believe they are looking upon the king of Olympus? These questions tormented me as I worked on the preliminary models, discarding attempt after attempt until the workshop floor was littered with rejected sketches and broken clay forms. Herodorus proved invaluable during those long months. He had grown from the frightened boy his father had brought to me into a skilled craftsman with an intuitive understanding of my vision. When I worked in silence, lost in contemplation, he seemed to know exactly what tool I needed, what material should be prepared. His loyalty never wavered, even when the political storms from Athens began to reach us in our sanctuary. The first ominous letter arrived on a day when we had just completed the delicate work on Zeus's right hand, which would hold the figure of Nike, goddess of victory. The messenger, dust-covered from his long journey, handed me a scroll with trembling hands. Even before I broke the seal, I sensed that my peaceful exile was about to end. The letter was brief, but devastating. A certain Menon, whom I barely remembered as one of my failed students, had formally accused me, before the Athenian assembly, of stealing gold intended for Athena's statue. The accusation was absurd, as Pericles had wisely advised. All the gold elements of the statue were removable and could be weighed at any time. But I understood immediately that this was not about gold. This was about destroying Pericles through me. "What is it, master?" Herodorus asked, seeing my face drain of color. "Troubles from home," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "They say I am a thief." The young man's eyes flashed with anger. Impossible. Who would dare make such an accusation? A failed student seeking revenge, or rather, a tool in the hands of Pericles' enemies. I set down the letter and looked around the workshop, at the half-completed Zeus rising majestically in the center. "They want me to return to Athens to defend myself." "But you cannot leave now," Herodorus protested. "The statue is not finished. The Olympic Committee, priests, all of Hellas, is waiting for its completion." I shared his anguish, but duty to my homeland called louder than artistic ambition. "I am an Athenian, Herodorus. If I do not return to face these charges, they will declare me guilty in absentia. My reputation, and worse, Pericles' position, will be destroyed." "Then let me come with you," he pleaded. "You will need loyal friends in Athens." "No," I said firmly. "You must stay and protect our work. Continue with the smaller details. The decorations on the throne, the sandals. I will return as soon as I can clear my name." But even as I spoke these words, a cold certainty settled in my heart. The political winds in Athens had shifted dramatically since I left. Pericles himself was under attack. The Great Plague had devastated the city, and people sought someone to blame for their misfortunes. The brilliant statesman who had made Athens the jewel of the Mediterranean was now seen by many as the cause of their suffering. During the days it took me to prepare for departure, more disturbing news arrived. Anaxagoras, Pericles' beloved teacher and my philosophical mentor, had been charged with impiety for his scientific theories about the nature of the Sunday. Rather than face an Athenian jury, the wise old man had fled the city. If Athens would turn against someone of his stature and learning, what hope did I have? Yet I could not abandon Pericles in his hour of need. Our friendship had forged not just the physical beauty of the Acropolis, but the very soul of democratic Athens. Together we had created a vision of what humanity could achieve when freed from the chains of tradition and superstition. That vision was now under assault, and I could not cower in Olympia, while my dearest friend faced his enemies alone. The night before my departure, I walked alone through the sacred grove surrounding the temple. The ancient olive trees, their gnarled branches reaching toward the stars, seemed to whisper warnings of the trials ahead. I thought of all the Olympic victors who had competed here, driven by the same passion for excellence that had motivated my artistic endeavors. Would I prove worthy of the same courage they had shown in their competitions? Standing before the temple that would house my Zeus, I made a silent vow. Whatever fate awaited me in Athens, I would return to complete this work. The Father of the Gods deserved nothing less than perfection, and I would not let political machinations deprive the world of this divine vision. When dawn came, Herodorus was waiting by my packed belongings, his young face etched with worry. "Master," he said quietly, "I fear you go to your doom." "Perhaps," I acknowledged, "but a man must face his destiny with dignity. Continue the work, my boy. If I do not return..." You have learned enough to complete what we have started. Don't speak such words, he begged. You will return. You must return. I embraced him then, this loyal student who had become like a son to me. Whatever happens, remember this. We serve something greater than ourselves. Art, beauty, the divine spark that elevates humanity above mere survival. That service never ends, regardless of the price we pay. The journey to Athens felt like a march to execution. Each mile brought me closer to a city I no longer recognized. A place where fear and suspicion had replaced the confident optimism of Pericles' Golden Age. The ship that carried me seemed to crawl across the wine-dark sea, as if even the elements conspired to delay the inevitable confrontation. As the familiar outline of Attica appeared on the horizon, I found myself remembering not the glory days of construction and creativity, but the simple moment when I first met Pericles on the rubble-strewn Acropolis. 2 young men with impossible dreams had stood among the ruins left by Persian invaders and dared to imagine something greater rising from the destruction. Now one of those dreamers was sailing toward what might be his final judgment, while the other waited in a city that had grown suspicious of the very dreams that had made it great. The harbor at Piraeus bustled with its usual activity. Merchants hawking their wares, slaves loading and unloading cargo, fishermen mending their nets. Life continued its eternal rhythms, indifferent to the personal drama unfolding in my heart. I had created works that would outlast empires. But in this moment, I felt as fragile and temporary as morning mist. Among the crowd waiting on the dock, I spotted a familiar figure, not Pericles himself, who would have been too conspicuous, but one of his trusted agents. The man's grim expression told me everything I needed to know about the political climate I was entering. The Golden Age was ending, and those who had built it were now being called to account by a populace grown weary of greatness. As my feet touched Athenian soil once more, I whispered a prayer to my patron goddess. Athena, grant me the wisdom to navigate these treacherous waters. Help me preserve not just my own honor, but the legacy we have built together. The statue of Athena Promonchos, my own creation, gleamed in the distance atop the Acropolis, but even her bronze spear seemed to droop under the weight of the city's changing mood. The agent approached with studied casualness. Phidias, he murmured, you are expected, but beware, the nets are already cast, and many who call themselves your friends have proven to have remarkably flexible loyalties. I nodded, unsurprised by this warning. In times of political upheaval, prudence often masquerades as wisdom, and many who had once celebrated our achievements would now distance themselves from any association with controversy. The trial that awaited me would be as much about the direction of Athens itself as about my personal guilt or innocence. Yet as I walked through the familiar streets toward whatever destiny awaited, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had lived fully, loved deeply, and created works that touched the divine. Whatever judgment mortal men might render, the gods themselves had already weighed my efforts and found them worthy. The Parthenon still crowned the Acropolis. Athena still gazed protectively over her city, and in distant Olympia, my unfinished Zeus waited patiently for my return. The ultimate measure of a life, I realized, is not whether it ends in triumph or tragedy, but whether it has added something beautiful and true to the world. By that standard, I could face whatever came next with equanimity. Athens might reject me, but art itself would remember. The Athens I entered bore little resemblance to the confident, prosperous city I had left behind. The Great Plague, which had claimed nearly a third of the population, including Pericles' own sons, had left visible scars everywhere. Empty houses stood with doors sealed, their owners either dead or fled to the countryside. The agora, once buzzing with intellectual discourse and commercial activity, now hummed with a different energy, the dangerous murmur of a populace seeking scapegoats for their misfortunes. I was conducted not to my old workshop or to Pericles' home, but to a modest dwelling in a quiet district where I could remain inconspicuous until the formal proceedings began. The house belonged to Callicrates, one of the architects of the Parthenon, a man whose loyalty to our cause had never wavered despite the shifting political winds. "My old friend," Callicrates said, embracing me with genuine warmth. "I wish your return were under happier circumstances." "How bad is it truly?" I asked, setting down my few belongings. His face grew grave. "Worse than you might imagine. The people are frightened, angry, looking for someone to blame for their suffering. Pericles has managed to hold on to power, but his support grows weaker each day. Your accuser, this Menon, has been very clever. He's not just attacking you, but using your case to strike at the entire cultural program that defined our Golden Age." "And what of Aspasia?" Callicrates' expression darkened further. "Also under attack. They accuse her of impiety, of corrupting Athenian youth, of undue influence over Pericles. Some even blame her for the war with Sparta. She faces her own trial." The full scope of the conspiracy became clear to me then. This was not merely personal revenge by a failed student, but a coordinated assault on everything Pericles represented. By attacking those closest to him, his teacher Anaxagoras, his beloved Aspasia, and his artistic collaborator, his enemies sought to isolate and destroy him without the risk of directly challenging his still considerable political skills. "Has he asked to see me?" I inquired. "He dare not," Callicrates replied. "Any public association with you now would only fuel his enemies' arguments that he is part of your alleged conspiracy. But private messages have been sent. He knows you have returned, and he grieves for what you must endure." I spent that first evening in Athens, walking the familiar streets, observing how the mood of the city had changed. Where once citizens had looked upon the Acropolis with pride, now I caught occasional glances of resentment. The Parthenon, that crown jewel of Pericles' building program, had become in some minds a symbol of wasteful extravagance during a time of war and plague. The very achievement that should have assured our immortality had become another weapon in our enemy's arsenal. At the workshop where I had once carved the face of Athena, I found a different master at work, surrounded by commissions for grave markers and memorial reliefs. The plague had created a booming business in monuments to the dead. He looked up nervously as I entered, clearly recognizing me but uncertain whether acknowledgement would be wise or dangerous. "Peace, friend," I said gently. "I come only to look upon the place where happier work was once done." He relaxed slightly. "You are Phidias. I have always admired your work. The Athena Parthenos is—" He struggled for words. "Is now evidence in a legal proceeding?" I completed his thought with bitter humor. Such is the fate of beauty in times of political strife. As I prepared to leave, the younger sculptor found his courage. "Master, for what it's worth, every craftsman in Athens knows the charges against you are false. Your integrity is legendary among those who work with their hands." His words warmed me more than any royal patronage could have. The common artisans, at least, still remembered who I truly was. Yet I knew that in the court proceedings to come, their voices would carry little weight against the orchestrated outrage of my accusers. The formal summons arrived 3 days later, delivered by a herald whose embarrassed manner suggested he knew the nature of his errand. I was commanded to appear before a tribunal of 500 citizens to answer charges of theft and impiety. The trial would begin in 1 week, giving me little time to prepare a defense against accusations that were as absurd as they were politically motivated. Callicrates helped me understand the legal landscape I faced. The jury would be selected by lot from eligible citizens, ostensibly to ensure fairness, but in practice, the process could be manipulated through careful timing and the circulation of inflammatory rumors designed to prejudice potential jurors against me before they ever heard the evidence. "They will focus on 2 main charges," he explained. "First, the theft of gold, which they know can be disproven but which serves to establish you as fundamentally dishonest. Second, the impiety charges based on your inclusion of contemporary portraits in the sacred scenes on Athena's shield." "The gold charge is nonsense," I said. "As you know, Pericles insisted that all gold elements be removable precisely to avoid such accusations." "Yes, but by the time they weigh the gold and confirm nothing is missing, The jury will have already heard days of testimony, painting you as a thief and a blasphemer. The truth, when it finally emerges, may seem anticlimactic compared to the dramatic accusations. The impiety charge was more complex and dangerous. Ancient Greek law was deliberately vague about religious offenses, allowing prosecutors wide latitude in defining what constituted an insult to the gods. My decision to include recognizable portraits of Pericles and myself among the warriors on Athena's shield had been bold, perhaps even provocative. But it was hardly unprecedented. Many artists had included contemporary figures in their religious works, yet in the current climate, this artistic choice could easily be portrayed as arrogant self-deification. My enemies would argue that by placing our images alongside divine figures, we had committed the ultimate hubris, claiming equality with the gods themselves. It was a charge that could carry the death penalty. As the day of trial approached, I found myself thinking often of Aspasia. She too faced similar accusations of impiety, though her trial was scheduled for later. The woman whose intelligence and beauty had inspired both Pericles' love and my artistic vision was now branded as a dangerous foreign influence, a corrupting force that had led Athens astray from its traditional values. I wondered if she regretted the path that had brought her to this point. Had the love and intellectual stimulation she found with Pericles been worth the price she now paid, or did she, like me, find satisfaction in having lived fully and authentically, regardless of the consequences? The night before my trial began, I climbed once more to the Acropolis, moving carefully through shadows to avoid recognition. The Parthenon gleamed silver in the moonlight, its perfect proportions as breathtaking as the day we completed it. My Athena Parthenos stood within, tall and magnificent, her golden draperies catching and reflecting the light of the sacred lamps. Looking upon her, I felt no regret for the artistic choices that had brought me to this moment. She was perfect, not just as a work of art, but as an embodiment of the highest human aspirations. Whatever judgment mortal man might render tomorrow, she would stand as eternal testimony to what we had achieved in our brief golden moment. As dawn approached, I made my way back through the sleeping city to prepare for the ordeal ahead. In a few hours, I would stand before 500 of my fellow citizens and learn whether the Athens of Pericles still lived, or whether it had already been consumed by the forces of fear and reaction. The stakes could not have been higher. If I were condemned, it would not simply mean the end of one artist's career, but the effective repudiation of everything our cultural renaissance had represented. The trial of Phidias would be nothing less than the trial of Athenian democracy itself, a test of whether a free people could remain true to their highest ideals when faced with the inevitable challenges that test all human societies. Whatever the outcome, I was ready. The boy who had dreamed of restoring the Acropolis had become the man who actually did it. Now that same man would discover whether his fellow citizens still valued the dreams that had lifted them above the ordinary into the realm of the sublime. The court of the Heliaea stretched before me like an amphitheater of judgment. 500 citizens sat on wooden benches arranged in a great semicircle, their faces a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and predetermined hostility. The morning sun streamed through the open colonnade, casting long shadows across the floor where I would soon stand to defend not just my own honor, but the very ideals that had made Athens great. The prosecutor, a minor politician named Eucrates, who had attached himself to my case for personal advancement, stood at the speaker's platform. His voice carried well in the acoustic space, trained as he was in the arts of public speaking that democracy demanded. But where Pericles had used oratory to inspire and elevate, this man wielded it like a weapon, designed to tear down rather than build up. "Citizens of Athens," he began, his voice dripping with false righteousness, "we are gathered here to judge a man who has betrayed your trust, violated your sacred traditions, and enriched himself at your expense. The defendant stands accused not merely of theft, but of the far graver crime of hubris, the arrogance that leads men to place themselves on equal footing with the immortal gods." I watched the faces in the jury as he spoke. Many nodded along, already convinced by the weeks of rumors and inflammatory rhetoric that had preceded this moment. Others looked genuinely puzzled, as if they could not reconcile the accusations with the evidence of their own eyes. The magnificent buildings I had helped create, the statues that had brought glory to their city. Eucrates continued his opening statement with theatrical gestures and emotional appeals. He painted a picture of a man drunk with power and success, who had used his position to steal gold from the treasury and commit acts of blasphemy that endangered the very soul of Athens. Each accusation was carefully crafted to exploit the fears and resentments that had grown in the city since the plague began. "Look upon the shield of Athena Parthenos," he declared, pointing dramatically toward the Acropolis. "And what do you see? Not just warriors defending our goddess, but the faces of mortal men. The very defendant before you and his political patron Pericles. By what right do they claim equality with heroes and gods? By what arrogance do they insert themselves into the sacred narrative of our city's divine protection?" A murmur of disapproval rippled through the crowd. I had anticipated this argument, but hearing it voiced with such venom still stung. The artistic choice that had once seemed bold and celebratory now sounded, through Eucrates' rhetoric, like the ultimate act of presumption. When my turn came to speak, I rose slowly, feeling the weight of every eye upon me. I had rehearsed my defense carefully, but standing before these 500 men, my neighbors, fellow citizens, people I had served faithfully for decades, I felt the magnitude of what was at stake. "Citizens of Athens," I began, my voice clear despite the tremor of emotion I felt. "I come before you not as a criminal begging for mercy, but as a craftsman proud of his work and eager to defend both his integrity and the achievements we have built together." I spoke first of the gold, knowing this was the easier charge to refute. "My accusers claim I have stolen 40 talents of gold from the statue of our beloved Athena. Let us test this claim with the simplest of proofs." I gestured to the officials who had brought scales and measures to the court. "Strip the golden garments from the statue and weigh them in your presence. You will find every ounce accounted for, exactly as recorded in the public documents when the work was completed." This was the moment I had been most confident about. Pericles' foresight in making the gold removable would vindicate me completely on this charge. But as the officials began their preparations for the public weighing, I saw Eucrates' slight smile and realized that the destruction of his primary accusation was not the defeat he feared, but rather the dramatic climax he had planned. The weighing took most of the morning. Each piece of golden drapery was carefully removed from the statue, measured, and placed upon the scales. The crowd watched in tense silence as the evidence of my supposed crime was examined in minute detail. When the final tally was announced, it matched the official records exactly. Every talent, every ounce of gold was accounted for. But instead of the vindication I had expected, I saw only indifference on many faces. Eucrates had successfully prepared them for this moment, and the disproof of his primary charge seemed almost anticlimactic. Worse, he was ready with his response. "See how carefully the defendant prepared for this day," he declared, with mock admiration. "How cleverly he replaced the stolen gold when he learned of the charges against him. But gold can be replaced. The sacred honor of our city, once violated, can never be fully restored." It was masterful in its cynicism. He had made the proof of my innocence seem like evidence of my guilt, turning my vindication into confirmation of my cunning. I began to understand the true sophistication of the trap that had been laid for me. The afternoon was devoted to the impiety charges, and here the ground was far less solid beneath my feet. Eucrates called witness after witness to testify to the obvious presence of contemporary portraits in the religious scenes on Athena's shield. Each witness spoke with the certainty of hindsight, claiming they had always been troubled by these images, but had been too respectful to speak out earlier. "The defendant has made himself and his patron into heroes of myth," Eucrates thundered. "He has placed their faces among the warriors defending our goddess, claiming for them a status reserved for the gods alone. This is not art. This is blasphemy of the highest order." When I was finally allowed to respond, I chose my words carefully. "Citizens, I ask you to consider what art is meant to accomplish. Is it not to inspire us to greatness? To show us not just what we are, but what we might become? When I carved those faces on Athena's shield, I sought to remind future generations that the defense of our city is not accomplished by gods alone, but by mortal men who rise to heroic stature through their devotion to ideals greater than themselves. But I could see that my explanation, however eloquent, was falling on deaf ears. The crowd had been primed to see hubris where I intended inspiration, blasphemy where I had meant honor. The artistic and philosophical arguments that might have swayed an educated audience like the one Pericles commanded held little power in this atmosphere of fear and resentment. As the day wore on, I began to understand that this trial was never truly about the specific charges against me. It was about the direction of Athens itself, whether the city would continue on the path of cultural and intellectual achievement that Pericles and I represented, or whether it would turn back to a more conservative, inward-looking vision of what Athens should be. The final speakers of the day drove this point home with brutal clarity. They spoke of the plague as divine punishment for the city's arrogance, of the war with Sparta as the inevitable result of overreach, of the building program as wasteful extravagance during times of hardship. In their telling, every achievement of the Golden Age became a symbol of excess and hubris. The gods have already rendered their judgment, declared one elderly citizen who claimed to speak for the common people. They have sent plague and war to humble us, to remind us that mortals who reach too high will inevitably fall. This trial is merely our opportunity to acknowledge their wisdom and return to the simple virtues that made Athens strong. As evening fell and the court adjourned for the day, I walked slowly through the streets that had once celebrated my work but now seemed filled with suspicious eyes and whispered accusations. The city I had helped transform into a beacon of human achievement had become a place where such achievement was seen as dangerous pride. That night, alone in Callicrates' house, I sat in the garden and looked up at the Acropolis. The Parthenon glowed silver in the moonlight, as magnificent as ever. My Athena Parthenos stood within, surrounded by the gold that had been stripped from her earlier that day and would be replaced tomorrow. The beauty remained, unchanged by the political storms swirling around it. I thought of Herodotus in distant Olympia, working on the Zeus that awaited my return. Would I live to complete that masterwork, or would this trial mark the end of everything I had sought to accomplish? More importantly, if Athens could turn so completely against the ideals that had elevated it, what did that say about the permanence of any human achievement? Yet even in my despair, I found a strange comfort in the thought that art itself might outlast the political passions of the moment. The Parthenon would stand long after Eucrates was forgotten. The Athena Parthenos would inspire wonder in viewers who knew nothing of this trial. Perhaps that was victory enough, not the vindication of the artist, but the survival of the art. As I prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring the final phase of my ordeal, I whispered a prayer to the goddess I had served so faithfully. Athena, let wisdom prevail over passion, truth over convenience, and beauty over the forces that would drag us back into darkness. Whether she heard me, or whether any mortal prayer could alter the course of events now in motion, remained to be seen. The second day of my trial dawned gray and overcast, as if the very heavens reflected the somber mood that had settled over Athens. I arrived at the court early, hoping to find even one friendly face among the jurors, but saw only the grim expressions of men who had already made up their minds. The preliminary ceremonies felt like funeral rites for a democracy that was slowly consuming itself. Eucrates began the day with what he called his final evidence, a parade of witnesses who claimed to have first-hand knowledge of my crimes. Most were minor figures seeking favor with the prosecution, but among them was one face that made my heart sink. Menon himself, the failed student whose accusations had started this entire ordeal. He had grown soft and round in the years since I had dismissed him from my workshop, his face bearing the marks of dissipation and resentment, but his voice was clear and confident as he took the stand, well rehearsed in the testimony that would seal my fate. I worked closely with the defendant for nearly 2 years, he began, his words carefully measured for maximum impact. I observed his methods, his attitudes, his contempt for traditional religious practices. He often spoke of the old gods as primitive superstitions that needed to be replaced by more sophisticated understanding. This was a complete fabrication, of course. I had never spoken of the gods with anything but reverence, understanding as I did that my art was meant to serve them. But Menon's lies were delivered with such conviction that I saw several jurors nodding in apparent recognition of behaviors they thought they remembered. He took particular pride, Menon continued, in placing himself and Pericles among the divine figures on Athena's shield. He called it educating the people to recognize real heroes among the mythical ones. When I expressed concern about the propriety of this choice, he laughed and said that future generations would worship Pericles as a god anyway. So why not begin the process early? The courtroom erupted in outraged murmurs. I wanted to leap to my feet and denounce these vicious lies, but my legal advisor restrained me with a firm hand on my shoulder. To respond emotionally to Menon's performance would only confirm the image of arrogant defiance that my accusers were trying to create. But the most devastating moment came when Eucrates called his final witness, a young priest from the temple of Athena, who claimed to have been present during the statue's consecration. His testimony was brief but precisely targeted to inflame religious sensibilities. As the sacred oils were poured and the prayers offered, the priest declared, I noticed that the defendant was not participating in the rituals with proper reverence. Instead, he stood apart, observing our ceremonies with what I can only describe as amusement. When the high priestess called upon Athena to bless her new image, I saw him smile and whisper something to Pericles. Later, I learned that he had said, she should be thanking us for making her beautiful. This final lie was so outrageous, so perfectly crafted to confirm every suspicion about my alleged hubris, that I could not contain myself. I rose despite my advisor's restraint, and spoke directly to the court. This is false testimony from beginning to end, I declared, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent courtroom. I have never spoken of any god with disrespect, never treated sacred ceremonies with amusement, never claimed credit that belongs to divine inspiration alone. These witnesses lie to serve their own purposes and those of my political enemies. But even as I spoke, I could see that my passionate denial was being interpreted as the defensive reaction of a guilty man caught in his crimes. The careful web of lies and half-truths had been woven too skillfully for simple truth to cut through it. Eucrates rose for his closing argument, with the satisfied air of a hunter approaching his trapped prey. His final speech was a masterpiece of demagoguery, combining religious outrage, political resentment, and personal attack into a devastating indictment, not just of me, but of everything the Golden Age had represented. Citizens of Athens, he thundered, you have heard the evidence. You have seen the proof of this man's crimes against our city and our gods. But this trial is about more than one arrogant artist who forgot his place. It is about the direction of our beloved Athens itself. For too long, we have been told that bigger is better, that newer is superior, that traditional values must give way to foreign innovations. We have been persuaded to spend our treasure on monuments to human pride, rather than practical needs of our people. We have been encouraged to elevate men to divine status, while neglecting the worship of our true protectors. The plague that devastated our city was no accident. It was divine punishment for our hubris. The war that drains our resources and claims our young men is the natural consequence of arrogance that makes enemies of natural allies. The suffering you see in your streets today is the price we pay for forgetting that we are mortals, not gods. He gestured dramatically toward me. This man represents everything that has gone wrong with Athens. His very existence mocks the simple virtues that made our city great. By condemning him, you send a message that Athens remembers its proper place in the cosmic order. By showing mercy to him, you invite further divine wrath upon yourselves and your children. The effect was electric. I could see the transformation in the jurors' faces as fear and religious anxiety overwhelmed whatever appreciation they might have had for artistic achievement. Eucrates had successfully transformed a trial for theft and impiety into a referendum on the soul of Athens itself. When my turn came for a final statement, I knew that eloquence alone would not save me. The mob had been skillfully prepared to see in me everything they feared about the direction their city had taken. Yet I could not remain silent in the face of such systematic distortion of everything I had tried to accomplish. Citizens of Athens, I began, my voice steady, despite the hopelessness I felt. I stand before you as a man who has devoted his entire life to the service of this city and its gods. Every chisel blow, every design choice, every moment of labor has been offered in the spirit of worship and civic devotion. The buildings that crown our Acropolis will stand for centuries as testimony to what Athenians can accomplish when they dare to reach for excellence. The statues that grace our temples will inspire wonder and reverence in generations yet unborn. These achievements belong not to me alone, but to all of us. They are the collective expression of a free people who refuse to accept that human limitations must define human aspirations. If you condemn me today, you condemn not just one artist, but the very spirit that lifted Athens above its neighbors and made it a beacon for all humanity. If you choose fear over courage, suspicion over celebration, small-mindedness over greatness, then the plague and war my accusers cite as divine punishment will seem minor compared to the spiritual death you will have imposed upon yourselves. I paused, looking out over the sea of faces that would decide my fate. I am prepared to accept whatever judgment you render, but I pray that in calmer times you will remember that Athens was made great not by those who counseled caution and conformity, but by those who dared to dream of touching the divine through human excellence. The voting began immediately after my statement. Each juror was given 2 bronze tokens, one marked for condemnation, one for acquittal, and asked to place one in the urn designated for his choice. The process took nearly an hour, during which I stood in the center of the courtroom, surrounded by the murmur of 500 men deciding whether the work of my lifetime represented inspiration or blasphemy. When the count was announced, I felt no surprise, only a profound sadness for what Athens had become. 320 votes for condemnation, 180 for acquittal. The margin was decisive enough to leave no room for appeals or second thoughts. Eucrates had won his victory, but as I looked at his triumphant face, I wondered if he truly understood what he had destroyed. In condemning me, Athens had turned its back on the ideals that had made it great. The Golden Age was truly over, killed not by foreign enemies or natural disasters, but by the fear and small-mindedness of its own citizens. The penalty phase would come tomorrow, where the court would decide between the punishment Eucrates demanded, death, and whatever alternative I might propose. But as I was led from the courtroom through crowds of jeering spectators, I knew that the real judgment had already been rendered. Athens had chosen to become something smaller and meaner than it had been, and no individual fate could change that fundamental transformation. That night, as I sat in my temporary prison awaiting the final phase of my trial, I thought not of myself, but of Herodorus, working alone in Olympia on our unfinished Zeus. Would he have the strength to complete the work without me? Would anyone remember, in the years to come, that Athens had once dared to create beauty that aspired to the divine? Perhaps that would be enough. Not the vindication of the artist, but the survival of the art. The Parthenon would outlast Eucrates and all his kind. My Athena Parthenos would stand as eternal testimony to what we had achieved in our brief moment of greatness. And somewhere in the future, when Athens had paid the full price for its retreat from excellence, perhaps new artists would find inspiration in what we had dared to attempt. With that thought, I found a measure of peace, even in defeat. The gods might judge mortals harshly, but they remembered beauty long after they had forgotten the names of those who created or destroyed it. In the end, that remembrance might prove more lasting than any earthly victory. The final phase of my trial came swiftly, almost as if the city were eager to be done with the whole affair. The penalty phase was a mere formality. Eucrates demanded death, as I had expected, while I proposed exile and the forfeiture of my citizenship. The judges, having already declared me guilty of impiety, showed no inclination toward mercy. The vote was closer this time. 260 for death, 240 for exile, but close enough to commute my sentence. I would live, but as a man without a country, stripped of everything that had once defined my identity as an Athenian artist. In some ways, this felt like a crueler fate than death itself. As I was led back to my temporary prison to await the formal banishment ceremonies, I found myself thinking not of my own fate, but of the message this trial would send throughout the Greek world. Athens, once the beacon of artistic achievement and intellectual freedom, had publicly repudiated those very qualities. The damage to our collective reputation would outlast any individual punishment. Callicrates visited me that final evening, his face drawn with grief and exhaustion. The trial had taken its toll on him as well. As one of the architects of the Parthenon, he too was now viewed with suspicion by those who saw our building program as evidence of hubris and excess. "I have brought you something," he said quietly, producing a small scroll from beneath his hymation. "Word from Olympia." My hands trembled as I unrolled the message from Herodorus. His script, usually so neat and careful, showed signs of haste and emotion. "Master, I have heard the terrible news from Athens. The work continues here. I have completed the throne decorations as you instructed, and the local craftsmen speak of nothing but your return. The Olympic Committee has sent word that they will not be swayed by Athenian politics in matters of sacred art. Your place here remains secure, should you choose to come. But Master, I must tell you truthfully, the statue feels incomplete without your guiding hand. The face of Zeus requires the touch that only you can provide. I have done my best with the body and drapery, following your designs exactly. But the soul of the work awaits your return. Come soon, if you can. Your faithful student and son in art, Herodorus. Reading these words, I felt a spark of hope kindle in my chest for the first time since the trial began. There was still work to be done, still beauty to be created. Athens might have rejected me, but Zeus still awaited my return in distant Olympia. "There is more," Callicrates said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Certain friends have made arrangements. You need not wait for the formal banishment. A ship leaves for Corinth at midnight, and from there you can make your way to Olympia. It would be safer than remaining here until the ceremonies are complete." I understood his meaning. The crowd that had celebrated my condemnation might not be satisfied with mere exile. There were those who would see my continued existence, even in banishment, as an affront to the gods who had supposedly demanded my punishment. Athens had become a dangerous place for anyone associated with the old regime. "What of Pericles?" I asked. "And Aspasia?" Callicrates' face grew even more grim. "Pericles fights for his political life. His enemies circle like wolves, using your conviction as proof that the gods have turned against his entire program. As for Aspasia, her trial begins next month. The outcome..." He shrugged helplessly. "Who can say? The city seems determined to purge itself of everything that once made it great." As midnight approached, I gathered my few possessions and prepared to leave Athens forever. Callicrates led me through dark streets to a small harbor where a merchant vessel waited, its captain already nervous about the nature of his passenger. Gold had changed hands to ensure his silence, but I could see in his eyes the fear that association with me might bring divine retribution upon his ship. Before boarding, I took one last look toward the Acropolis. The Parthenon rose against the star-filled sky like a dream made manifest in stone, its perfect proportions unchanged by the political storms that raged around it. My Athena Parthenos stood within, golden and magnificent, eternal testimony to what we had achieved in our brief moment of glory. "Farewell, Athens," I whispered. "May you one day remember what you have cast away." The ship moved silently through the dark waters of the Saronic Gulf, carrying me away from the city I had served so faithfully and toward an uncertain future. As the lights of Piraeus faded behind us, I tried to focus my thoughts on the work that awaited me in Olympia, rather than dwell on all I was leaving behind. The journey to Corinth passed without incident. Though I noticed the crew's furtive glances and whispered conversations, word of my condemnation had spread quickly, and even these simple merchants knew they carried a man marked by the gods, or so they believed. I spent most of the voyage in contemplation, planning the final details of the Zeus statue and trying to put the bitterness of recent events behind me. From Corinth, the overland journey to Olympia took several days. I traveled in the company of merchants and pilgrims, keeping my identity hidden beneath a plain traveling cloak. It was strange to pass unrecognized through towns where my name had once been celebrated, to hear casual discussion of Athenian politics without anyone knowing they shared the road with one of the key figures in those very events. At an inn near Nemea, I overheard a conversation that chilled my heart. Two Athenian merchants were discussing the latest news from home with evident satisfaction. "They say Pericles is finished," one declared, taking a long drink from his wine cup. "His own tribe has turned against him. They blame him for the plague, for the war, for the bankruptcy of the treasury. The great man who would make Athens rival the gods themselves has been brought low by his own hubris." "And what of the others?" asked his companion. "The sculptors and philosophers who led us astray. Phidias is banished, of course, if he hasn't been murdered by now. The people were calling for his blood after the trial. As for that foreign woman, Aspasia, her fate will be decided soon enough. Athens is finally returning to its proper respect for divine authority. They spoke of me as if I were already dead. And perhaps, in a sense, I was. The Phidias who had walked proudly through Athenian streets, celebrated as the greatest artist of his age, had indeed perished in that courtroom. The man who now made his way toward Olympia was someone different. An exile seeking only to complete one final work before age and circumstance ended his career forever. When I finally arrived at the Olympic sanctuary, the familiar sight of the temple complex brought tears to my eyes. Here at least was a place where beauty and excellence were still valued, where the political passions of individual cities gave way to the higher calling of honoring the gods. The Olympic Committee had been true to their word. Despite pressure from Athens, they had refused to revoke my commission. Herodorus was waiting for me in the workshop, his young face bright with relief and joy at my arrival. He had grown in the months of my absence, both in skill and in confidence. The work he had completed in my absence was of exceptionally high quality, faithful to my designs while showing the development of his own artistic voice. "Master," he said, embracing me with unrestrained emotion, "I feared I would never see you again. Athens has gone mad with fear and superstition." "Athens chose its path," I replied, trying to keep the bitterness from my voice. "We must choose ours. Show me what you have accomplished." For the next several hours, we walked around the partially completed statue, examining every detail. The body of Zeus was magnificent, nearly 40 feet of ivory and gold, rising from an elaborate throne. The drapery fell in perfect folds. The muscles were defined with anatomical precision. The overall proportions spoke of divine majesty, but the face remained unfinished, a blank canvas awaiting the expression that would transform mere craftsmanship into transcendent art. "I could not attempt it," Herodorus admitted. "I knew that the face of the King of Gods required your touch alone. I have prepared everything. The finest ivory from our African expedition, gold beaten to the perfect thinness, tools sharpened and ready. The face of Zeus awaits your vision." Standing before the statue in the dim light of the workshop, I felt a profound sense of completion. This was why I had been preserved through the trials in Athens, why fate had brought me safely to Olympia, despite the hatred of my former countrymen. Zeus himself had protected me so that I might complete this final masterwork. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into the work with an intensity that surprised even me. Each day began before dawn, and continued until my aging eyes could no longer discern fine details in the lamplight. The face of Zeus emerged gradually from the ivory, each feature carefully considered and meticulously crafted. This was not the idealized beauty of my earlier works, nor the classical perfection that had defined my Athena. The face I carved for Zeus was something deeper and more complex, a countenance that spoke of infinite wisdom tempered by compassion, of power that could destroy worlds held in check by justice, of divine authority that invited worship rather than demanding it through fear. As word of my presence in Olympia spread, visitors began arriving from across the Greek world. Some came merely out of curiosity, hoping to glimpse the disgraced artist who had fallen from grace in Athens, but others came seeking something more profound. Pilgrims and artists who understood that they were witnessing the creation of something extraordinary. Among the visitors was a delegation from Sparta, Athens' great rival. Their leader, a stern-faced Ephoros named Brasidas, examined the statue with critical eyes before turning to address me. "Athenian," he said, his voice carrying the clipped authority of Spartan speech. "Your former city has declared you an enemy of the gods, yet here you create what may be the most divine image ever wrought by mortal hands. How do you answer this contradiction?" I considered his question carefully before responding. I answered that the gods judge art differently than men do. Athens may have condemned me, but Zeus himself brought me safely to this place to complete his image. Let others interpret that as they will. Brasidas nodded slowly, his austere features showing something that might have been approval. Athens has grown weak through luxury and philosophical speculation, but in this work, I see the strength that once made Greeks feared throughout the world. Perhaps the gods preserve what is worth preserving, regardless of its mortal origins. As the statue neared completion, I found myself working with a feverish intensity that worried Herodorus. I slept little, ate sparingly, and seemed driven by a certainty that time was running short. Perhaps I sensed what fate had in store, or perhaps the exile and disgrace had taken a greater toll on my health than I cared to admit. The face of Zeus was the last element to be completed, and I saved it for a day when I felt my hands were steadiest and my vision clearest. As I made the final touches to the eyes that would seem to gaze with divine intelligence upon all who entered the temple, I felt a strange sensation, as if the statue itself had become aware of its own completion. When the work was finished at last, we arranged for the formal unveiling. Representatives from across the Greek world gathered in the temple, including Olympic officials, priests from major sanctuaries, and artists who had traveled great distances to witness this moment. The statue was revealed as the morning sun streamed through the temple's eastern door, and the effect was breathtaking. Zeus sat upon his throne in divine majesty, his head nearly touching the temple's ceiling. His right hand held a small figure of Nike, goddess of victory. His left grasped a scepter topped with an eagle. His golden robes caught and reflected the light, while his ivory flesh seemed to glow with inner radiance. But it was the face that truly transformed the work from impressive to transcendent. The expression I had carved spoke of all the qualities that men attributed to the king of the gods: power and wisdom, justice and mercy, authority and benevolence. Those who gazed upon it felt they were truly in the presence of divinity, not merely viewing a representation of it. The statue seemed alive, aware, ready to speak words that would reshape the world. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Many fell to their knees in spontaneous worship, overwhelmed by the sense of divine presence. Others wept openly, moved by beauty that seemed to transcend mortal limitations. Even the skeptical Spartans were visibly impressed, their leader Brasidas declaring it a work worthy of the gods themselves. But as the crowds dispersed and the excitement of the unveiling faded, I found myself facing a profound emptiness. The great work of my life was complete. Zeus gazed down with serene majesty, perfect in every detail, eternal in his divine splendor. What remained for an aging artist whose masterpiece was finished? That night, as I walked alone through the sacred grove surrounding the temple, I felt a presence beside me. At first I thought it might be Herodorus, concerned about my mood in the aftermath of our triumph, but when I turned, I saw nothing but shadows dancing in the moonlight. Yet the presence remained, and somehow I knew I was no longer alone. In this sacred place, a voice spoke, not in words but directly to my consciousness, filling me with a certainty that transcended normal understanding. The voice told me that my work in the mortal world was complete. The statue of Zeus would stand for centuries as testimony to the heights human artistry could achieve when inspired by divine vision. Athens might have rejected me, but the gods themselves had accepted my offering and found it worthy. I was being called to join those artists and visionaries whose souls had been deemed worthy of immortality. Not the crude bodily immortality that fearful men sought, but the eternal preservation of the creative spirit that had elevated humanity through beauty and truth. As dawn broke over Olympia, Herodorus found me seated peacefully in the workshop. My eyes closed, a slight smile on my lips. The loyal student who had become like a son to me tried desperately to wake me, but my spirit had already departed for realms where political trials and human judgments held no meaning. They say that in the moment of my death, the statue of Zeus smiled, not the fixed expression I had carved, but a momentary flash of divine acknowledgement that observers swore they witnessed. Perhaps it was merely the play of morning light on polished ivory. Or perhaps Zeus himself was welcoming the soul of his faithful servant into eternal rest. Epilogue. The memory of beauty. Years passed, and empires rose and fell. Athens, weakened by the very fears and suspicions that had condemned me, eventually fell to Spartan arms, and then to Macedonian conquest. The democracy that had once been the pride of the Greek world consumed itself through the same small-mindedness that had destroyed those who tried to make it great. Pericles died within a year of my exile, broken by political defeats and personal tragedy. Aspasia was acquitted of impiety charges, but lived the remainder of her life in obscurity, her brilliant mind silenced by a city that no longer valued intellectual discourse. The Golden Age that we had built together crumbled into civil war and foreign occupation. But the art survived. My Athena Parthenos stood guard over the Acropolis for nearly 1,000 years, inspiring countless generations with her golden beauty. The Parthenon itself became a symbol recognized throughout the world, its perfect proportions copied by architects who understood that some achievements transcend the political circumstances of their creation. In Olympia, the statue of Zeus became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Drawing pilgrims and tourists from across the Mediterranean, travelers wrote of the overwhelming sense of divine presence they felt in its company, of how the ivory face seemed to convey genuine intelligence and compassion. Even those who knew nothing of the controversies surrounding its creator were moved by the spiritual power it radiated. Herodotus, faithful to the end, became a renowned sculptor in his own right, founding a school that preserved and transmitted the techniques we had developed together. He often spoke to his students of the master who had taught him not just artistic skills, but the higher purpose that art must serve, to lift humanity above its limitations, and provide glimpses of the divine beauty that underlies all creation. As centuries passed and the ancient world gave way to new civilizations, both statues eventually perished. The Athena Parthenos was stripped of her gold by desperate emperors, and eventually destroyed by Christian zealots who saw pagan idolatry in her perfect form. The Zeus of Olympia met a similar fate, though some say it was transported to Constantinople and perished in a palace fire. Yet even in destruction, their influence endured. Artists of later ages studied copies and descriptions, drawing inspiration from works they could never see firsthand. The ideals of beauty and excellence that we had embodied in marble and gold lived on in the minds of those who understood that art's true immortality lies not in the preservation of physical materials, but in the eternal human aspiration to create something worthy of the gods. Perhaps that is the final irony of my story. Athens condemned me for hubris, for daring to place mortal figures alongside divine ones in sacred art. But time proved that the greatest hubris belonged to those who thought they could destroy the divine spark of creativity through political trials and public condemnation. Beauty, once created, belongs to all humanity. The Parthenon still stands, though now as ruins that speak more eloquently of vanished glory than its intact form ever did. Copies of my Zeus inspire awe in museums across the modern world. The art outlived the artist. The beauty outlasted the politics. The divine vision transcended the mortal circumstances of its creation. In the end, that may be victory enough. The boy who once dreamed of restoring the Acropolis became the man who created wonders that outlasted empires. The exile who fled Athens in disgrace left behind monuments that still define how humanity envisions divine beauty. The artist condemned for hubris achieved the only immortality that truly matters, the eternal preservation of the creative act itself, standing now in whatever realm the gods have prepared for those who serve beauty faithfully in life. I watch as new generations discover the power of art to transform the soul. The specific works may crumble, the individual names may be forgotten, but the impulse to reach beyond mortal limitations in search of transcendent beauty continues unabated. That impulse, more than any statue or temple, is my true monument. As long as human beings look upon the world and dream of making it more beautiful, the work we began in Golden Age Athens continues. as long as artists dare to envision perfection and struggle to make it manifest. The spirit that guided my hands still lives. The trial that condemned me has been forgotten by history. The judges who voted for my death have vanished without trace, but somewhere in the ruins of the Parthenon, in the descriptions of vanished wonders, in the dreams of artists yet unborn, Phidias, the sculptor, continues his work, reaching always toward that divine beauty that neither time nor human folly can ultimately destroy. This, perhaps, is what it means to touch the eternal through mortal hands, not to escape death, but to create something so beautiful that death itself cannot diminish its power to inspire. In achieving that, I achieved more than any earthly trial could take away, more than any human judgment could diminish. The fugitive became the eternal. The exile found his truest home. The condemned artist achieved the only vindication that matters. The immortal gratitude of every soul that has ever been lifted by the sight of beauty made manifest in the world.